My name is Kevin Rooney, and this is the second of 3 debates here in the unsafe zone, as we're calling these stranded debates. Is the prevent strategy turning teachers into spies? Yes or no? Question mark. That's the theme of today's debate. And we've got 4 speakers looking at this question. Is it a question of safeguarding? Is this a political question we're dealing with? A free speech question? A British values question? How should we approach it? Our 4 speakers are, first of all, on my right. Oops, the mic's on now. First of all, on my right is Liz Watts from EdComs, and she's research director there. And Liz will speak first. And then on my left, we have Zubeda Limbada, who will speak second. And Zubeda is director of ConnectJustice and a Clore Social Fellow. And then thirdly, on my right, we have Terry James, who's the head teacher at Queen's School Bushy, which, funny enough, is the school that I teach in as well. So he's my boss. And then on my extreme left, we have Toby Marshall, and Toby's an FE lecturer in social theory and a PhD researcher in sociology at University College London. We've got just under an hour and 15 minutes for this discussion. The way we'll work it is each speaker will speak for 5 minutes, and I'll be very tight on the time. And when they're finished speaking, I might ask them a question or two. I might allow them to pick each other up on things they've said, or we might go straight out to the audience if I feel there's people that want to ask questions. And feel free, guys, to get stuck in. Don't just ask questions, express your view, and we'll have a good old ding-dong amongst ourselves. It's not just going to be the 4 panellists. We'll have, as they say, maximum audience participation. So I think without further ado, Liz, if you're ready, we'll start off with yourself.
Great, thank you. So in my sort of response today, I'm going to refer to some research that we've conducted, which looks like this. On the printout, I haven't got any slides, so if you're interested in the stats, they're all in that leaflet that's on your chairs or chair next to you. And it's based on our teacher community that we run called EdComs Teachers. So if any teachers in the audience would like to take part in that sort of research, the web address is also on there. I think this question really goes to the heart of the debate about what schools are for. What is education all about? And I would contend that schools are really at the sort of epicentre of what it means to be a community. They're there to nurture and develop young people as individuals, yes, but they're also there to help young people learn to operate as part of society and protect them as they learn and grow in that process as they become sort of the citizens of the future. Schools clearly have a really wide-ranging safeguarding agenda that they have to deal with for their students. And in our research, it shows that teachers are concerned about everything from clearly abuse, which 70% said was a concern for them, neglect, keeping safe online, that's a really hot potato at the moment, and preventing radicalisation is also part of that, albeit at a much lower level. And it's less of a priority for teachers than, for example, their concerns about abuse amongst their pupils. I think that schools take a really holistic view of their role. In our survey, 88% of teachers thought that promoting community cohesion in school was important, and 77% thought that promoting British values was important. And only 55% thought that monitoring extremist behaviour was important. So it's still, over half, but at a lower level than things like community cohesion. And I think that reflects that teachers really want to promote that sense of community and create an environment in schools where all students feel safe and valued. And I think it's against that backdrop that Prevent operates. And I think rather than seeing Prevent as an attempt to turn them into spies, teachers see it as an extension of safeguarding. So in our survey, 84% said that Prevent had been discussed with them in a professional way in their school, and 92%, so almost everybody, agreed that schools have a role to play in identifying students at risk of radicalisation. So that's maybe a big tick for Prevent, but it's not all good news because only 50% of teachers thought that Prevent was effective in their school. So unpicking that a bit, it's quite interesting to see why that is. Is it about resistance to the kind of spy thing? So we asked our teachers whether they agreed with the NUT recently in the news was talking about prevent strategy causing suspicion in the classroom and confusion in the staff room. And we asked teachers whether they agreed or disagreed with that. And interestingly, it was a very mixed response. So 49% disagreed, but 22% agreed with that statement. So if there's a general agreement that schools should be doing something in this area, why is it that they're not really seeing the prevent as the answer for everything? And whilst I think it's, it's not just because it's a theory, because our research found that 48% of teachers had actually addressed an issue around extremism based on the issues identified by the NUT's education extremism guidance. So it is a real thing that's happening in schools, but they're not actually necessarily seeing it as the answer to all their problems. Our research found that although the majority of teachers felt confident about challenging extremist ideas in students, many are clearly doing just that. Far fewer are confident, and 37% not at all confident, that they have the knowledge to identify students who are at risk of being drawn into extremism. So it's almost as though when the ideas are presented in front of them, yes, they can address them, they can deal with those, they can talk about that, but actually identifying those students seems a step too far. And that seems to me to be the nub of the issues. Teachers do feel that schools are encouraging debate and discussion around things like terrorism and extremism. So it isn't that the conversations are being shut down, but identifying and categorising individual students at risk of extremism is really where we seem to be falling short. And in some of the feedback we got from our research, it sheds some light on that, in that many teachers were finding that prevent has come to be one-dimensional and very much focused in one area around Islam, rather than reflecting the issues that they may be facing in their own schools. So I'll just give you one example of a quote that we had. The focus seems to be on radicalisation via Islam. However, my school have pupils more at risk from the far right. While the prevent strategy recognises this, that message seems to have been lost or become much less of a focus. So I would say that rather than it being about fear of being a spy, it's more fear that this prevent strategy has been overtaken by one dimension, and what their teachers are reacting against is really the need to provide a more balanced view.
Fantastic, Liz. That was great timing as well. Zubeda, what's your take on this?
So, good afternoon. Just to emphasise that my organisation, ConnectJustice, what we do is about building trust with police and communities around extremism and exploitation, and we do work that's around research and training. And again, an emphasis is that our organisation doesn't receive any national government prevent funding, so I'll be advocating neither a pro or against prevent position. So I'll outline my 4 key points. The role of a teacher is to act as a facilitator of learning, provide students with the information and tools they need to understand, and to broaden the minds of the young. In the context of prevent, the role of debate, safe spaces, academic freedom, exploration of ideas, and the nurturing of inquiring minds are fundamental ingredients for students. Prevent forms part of the government's counter-terrorism strategy, and it's been in place since 2005. And the Channel programme, which is an intervention process that provides support to individuals at risk of being drawn into violent extremism, also has another piece of legislation called the Counter-Terrorism Security Act, which was introduced in 2015 and incorporated what we know as the safeguarding duty. And recently we also had the Counter-Extremism Bill, which proposed additional state powers. However, there was no visible definition of extremism. The point that I want to emphasise is that the UK has one of the toughest legislations around extremism and terrorism in Western Europe. So coming back to the question, my organisation engages with Prevent independently. Alongside research, we deliver training to educators and work with young people. So then why is there perception that Prevent is turning teachers into spies? And is the question raised legitimate? I would advocate that the word spy is a loaded term. It polarises. It's them and us. It asks who is right and wrong, and it suggests that if it's not something, then it's immediately the other. In some ways, it's reflective of the Prevent debate. Do you like it or do you not like it? Firstly, I would argue for nuance. And it would be correct to say some teachers feel that their role of nurturing minds and empowering young people to debate, question and argue viewpoints is being undermined if they now have to be the vanguard of preventing people being drawn into terrorism as part of the duty. Sure, there's something about safeguarding and being aware of a whole host of risks and vulnerabilities. So my second point is that in a school environment, is it the role of teachers to spot vulnerable young people? Do they understand different types of extremisms? And how can you avoid the easy dangers of stereotyping around race, religion, gender, and other cultural assumptions and stereotypes that are sometimes played out in the media? So a recent case, for example, the cucumber case. In 2016, a woman said that staff threatened her 4-year-old on the channel for the channel programme without parental awareness when the child drew a picture that staff thought was his father drawing a cooker bomb when in fact he was cutting a cucumber with a knife. In an exchange with the nursery staff, the mother asked the teacher, "When you look at me, from where do I look like a terrorist?" And the nursery staff responded by saying, "Well, did Jimmy Savile look like a paedophile?" Other examples in school include the words of a 10-year-old saying terrorist house being mistaken for terrorist house, and the 14-year-old boy involved in the eco-terrorism debates in his school being taken out of the classroom and being asked if he sympathised with ISIS by a teacher. So these are examples of things going wrong in the school environment. Thirdly, according to 2015 figures, referrals to the Channel DRAD scheme have been increasing each year, and that a third of referrals have been under the age of 18. In the first 5 months of 2015, there were more referrals to Channel than all of 2014, which tied in with the introduction of the duty. One teacher that we've talked to said she was concerned about the level of vulnerable young people being reported through the Channel programme, often falsely and as a result of poor training, and she noticed a worrying trend among teachers. So my point is how the lack of transparency around Channel, that is, who's referred, and why there's been no independent evaluation of Channel and questions around whether referred individuals in the Channel system will ever have their details deleted by the authorities. So it creates further questions around mistrust, lack of community confidence and transparency, which will impact on teacher consideration. And finally, another point where a teacher mentioned that he was fearful of Ofsted inspections and the implications it may carry if they're not seen to be acting in the spirit of the duty. After being asked who used their multi-faith prayer room in the West Midlands College, which was on a busy ground floor, and where the records were kept of who went in and out, the school's concern that predominantly Muslim pupils may feel watched and monitored was overridden because of this encounter with Ofsted. This leads me to 3 quick points I want you to consider. I do believe that any child that is vulnerable to extremism, bullying, child sexual exploitation should have adequate referral and monitoring arrangements in place. But what is the balance? Second, prevent can be a double-edged sword. It's a realistic concern which, if done wrong, has serious consequence. And lastly, we need to enable young people to navigate and air grievances in what we call safe spaces. But this should be non-state led. So to conclude, I would argue that prevent is not turning teachers into spies. Stopping a child from joining a movement such as IS or a far-right terror group requires actions, strategies and careful consideration of debates and an articulation of viewpoints that can be challenged in a safe space by teachers and educators. However, the lack of transparency in the prevent system, the overemphasis of bad training on specifically Islamist extremism as opposed to far-right extremism creates the febrile atmosphere of a venomous situation, which isn't healthy in a democratic society. Thank you.
Thanks, Zubeda. Your timing's great as well. Terry.
Thank you. I'm getting a little bit concerned. There's going to be too much consensus on this panel, I have to say. But still, because there are clearly links with the previous discussion, which for those of you who weren't here, was to grossly oversimplify about the need for children to be more resilient in the modern world. And the first thing I'd like to say, or the first 2 things I'd like to say is I'm certainly not going to sit here as an apologist for the prevent strategy, and I'll talk about some of the reasons why not in a minute. But there are clearly links, as I say, with the earlier discussion, and I would say that I did agree with most of what was said about the need for us not to be turning our children into wimps. And I think there's a similarity, because I think with that particular discussion, as with this one, you have to be careful not to throw the baby out with the bathwater. And I think, as is the case in many cases, you need to have some balance and also some common sense. And I fear that is what is missing in this instance from the prevent strategy, to be perfectly honest. As I say, I'm not sitting here as an apologist for prevent. I guess there's quite a few teachers and possibly some head teachers in the room who, like me, would have actually been subjected to the prevent training. And I have to say it was one of the most depressing and annoying experiences of my professional life. And at one stage, and there was a colleague that was sitting next to me while we were being trained, or talked at, I think is better to say, who leant over and whispered to me, do you think they're doing this just to wind you up? And I'm sure they weren't, but it certainly had that impact. And for those of you who haven't been through the process, despite the fact that they prefaced, first of all, they said at the beginning they would take no questions. They would take no questions because this wasn't for discussion, this is how it's going to be, there was no point. They were up against a very strict time schedule. It had to be done in a certain, I think you got 40 minutes, and it was going to take 40 minutes for them to show their 50 slides or wherever it was and talk at us. So please don't interrupt or don't expect any time for any questions. And then they a brief preamble when they said this is not anti-Muslim and it is designed to be relevant to all head teachers, and you really need to listen to what we're going to say and then make sure it gets disseminated to all of your staff. If I'd have been either a Muslim or a primary school head teacher, I'd have got even more annoyed than I was, because despite them saying that it wasn't anti-Muslim, there were 20 case studies and the first 19 were all about Muslim radicalisation. They then finally came up with one at the end, which I have to say looked like a real afterthought, which was about a young lad in the north being encouraged to join the EDL or something like that. It was an extreme right wing, but it was pretty much a sot. And none of them, despite the fact that the nature of things is, when you're talking to a group of head teachers in a local authority, the vast majority of them are going to be primary heads because there's more primary schools than secondary schools for obvious reasons. There were no primary school examples at all. Nothing about what you may or may not need to do as far as all the case studies were secondary age children in their views being in danger of being radicalised in sort of Islamic radicalisation. And I do agree wholeheartedly with Andy Burnham, a recent speech he made in Manchester referring to the prevent strategy, where he said the brand is so toxic it has got to go. And he compared, and I thought this really made me think, and it struck a chord actually, he compared the prevent strategy with the policy of internment in Northern Ireland. And he said it's building a climate of mutual suspicion and mistrust, and far from tackling extremism, it risks creating the very conditions for it to flourish. And certainly I've had to spend time meeting with and reassuring Muslim parents from our school that we are not going to be embracing the prevent strategy, and they have nothing to fear and worry about. And there was a lot of that. It's calmed down a little bit, because I think they've seen by our actions that we haven't been doing what they thought or feared that we were going to do. And I've also successfully argued with Ofsted, both in respect of my own school and also schools that I support and work with, that it is quite legitimate that we don't have a statement of British values on our website. My main argument being that last time I looked at any case, neither Voltaire or Ben Franklin were British, and that and to quote them in terms of your statement of British values is educationally unsound at the very least. But there were staff, and particular governors at my school, that were very nervous about us taking that approach because they thought that we might get ourselves into a lot of trouble. And it's conceivable that maybe with a less flexible Ofsted inspector that might have happened. I certainly have heard some schools that have suffered because of this. One area that I do agree with what has been said, I think particularly by Liz, is that I do look at this from a safeguarding child protection point of view and a child exploitation perspective. And I do think that whilst I don't believe that we should be taking all risks away from our children, and I do believe that some aspects of the safeguarding agenda have gone far too far, that schools do have a responsibility to safeguard their children and to try and prevent them from being exploited. Clearly, the word spies is deliberately provocative because if you actually turn that around and you put it in terms of do children have a responsibility to try and protect children, you get a different response. As is so often the case with hasty and ill-thought-out legislation, which was brought in, a bit like Dangerous Dogs Act, which was the prevent strategy was, it was unnecessary. There was already legislation in place which gives the schools and indeed individual teachers a duty of care, and it is important that that aspect of the work should be taken seriously.
Brilliant, Terry. Thanks very much. And last but not least, Toby.
Okay, thanks. I think there's some interesting issues that have been raised by what's been said already, and I think there's three questions that for me are worth considering. Terry, I mean, you described an interesting picture where a police officer can turn up to your school and say, this is going to happen, there will be no questions. And so my question is, it's interesting that we've got to that stage. I mean, it seems a sort of deep confusion over institutional authority that one set of professionals can just march into a school and tell you this is how it's going to be. And I think that's an interesting thing to dwell on. I wonder whether this is a safeguarding issue. Are we talking about political ideas? Is it useful to frame political ideas in terms of safeguarding? I mean, that's a question I'd have. And I suppose the challenging question for me, I am against prevent, and I'll argue why I'm against prevent in a second, but what's our alternative? I think that's the more interesting question perhaps, which is what do we stand for and what should we be doing if we're not doing prevent? But I think we do need to get rid of prevent first. My reasoning is as follows. As it was described to me, prevent was described as something that occupies the pre-criminal space. And in the briefing literature, it's something which schools and colleges are expected to show, quote, productive cooperation with. My basic suggestion is that it's illiberal to intervene before conspiracy. And more seriously, and I think Andy Burnham's comments are interesting here, I think it's counterproductive because it promotes fear and undermines, I'd argue, and this is my fundamental argument, prevent undermines one of our most powerful weapons against division and intolerance, which is a liberal education. Prevent, we should be clear, mainly aims to counter acts of violent extremism. That's its principal focus, and I think we all support that aim and the security services in that. But it does so by seeking to target as well those who are involved in what's called non-violent extremism. To quote again from the briefing document, it aims to challenge those, quote, who create an atmosphere conducive to terrorism. And this includes those who do not uphold British values, these being democracy, rule of law, individual liberty and tolerance. That might be quite a sizable portion of the population. So for me, this is a dangerously broad focus. Further, prevent places a special requirement on those who work with the young, the so-called prevent duty, which requires that they inform security services, let's be clear, this is led by the security services, if they judge a young person to be at risk of radicalisation. Now, ignoring the issue that you raised of misidentification, ludicrous misidentification, and the issue of self-fulfilling prophecy, if you tell someone they are a threat, then maybe they might become that threat. It seems to me it's quite possible that the prevent strategy will generate a few useful leads for the security services. I'm sure that's quite possible, and it may well be that it will prove in time that will have frustrated a terrorist act. But what I'd like to draw our attention to is at what costs. My suggestion is that trust, openness, transparency between teachers and students is the cornerstone of a liberal education. The kind of education that I advocate is one where students are free to express opinions without monitoring or fear of retribution. More positively, I see as valuable an education which is open and sees the benefit of engaging with a wide range of ideas, including those that some might consider to be extreme. I'm teaching politics this year. Let's hear all those positions. Most critically, I think it's important to recognise that teachers judge, judge us by our actions. We cannot profess liberalism and then act illiberally. If we value free speech, then we should enact it. Prevent, I worry, would close down debate and discussion by setting up security fences around the political discussions that we need to be having with the young at this moment in time. I'm for an education that's tolerant, critical, rational, open, but not indulgent, one which has a serious end in mind, which is the exploration of truth. Now, nothing that I've said is original. It's all standard issue, liberal educational viewpoint. And then these might be old ideals or old-fashioned, but I think they're hard-won principles. And I think we risk all of this by seeing education as a means to a security end. Securitizing pedagogy, in my view, promotes a culture of suspicion, hostility, anxiety, and it provides the alienated potentially with a powerful cultural script. We can do better than this, and this maybe brings us to the question. Each generation does need to be engaged with anew, and I believe that our most effective hearts and minds strategy is a liberal education. And we need to go and argue for that. We have to put our cards on the table and make those arguments. It's interesting that in the latest Prevent briefing, they seem to be recognising that there might be an issue here. Here's a quote from the latest briefing. Schools should be safe spaces in which children and young people can understand and discuss sensitive topics. The Prevent duty is not intended to limit discussion on these issues. Well, you said it. Schools should, however, be mindful of their existing duties that forbid political indoctrination and to secure a balanced presentation of political ideas. I support some of these sentiments, some of them I don't, but I'd suggest that perhaps one of the greatest obstacles to us winning the hearts and minds of the next generation is a fear and uncertainty over political ideas and an anxiety over the unintended outcomes of our discussion. Sadly, Prevent doesn't recognise that it might be making a contribution to the problem, but the challenge to us is, if not prevent, then what?
Thank you. Give them a round of applause, guys. So panel and audience, so the questions I picked up, there's a fair few. So what is political indoctrination? Is education in danger of serving the security agenda? And that point that Toby brought up, which was interesting, never thought about, what about the question of institutional authority? Who has it? And so other questions, should a liberal education allow extreme views in the classroom? Are we relativistic when it comes to British values? Are we happy with British values? And then two last questions. Are we blurring the distinction between extreme views and actions, terrorist actions, as someone expressed an extreme view? But the question I want to start with, panel, because I've always been damned to ask a panel this question on such a debate, and I have to say, I think Toby brought this up. Why are we framing it? Is it a given that when we're having this discussion about Prevent, that we frame it in the context of a safeguarding issue of children being vulnerable? Am I stupid? Am I missing something here? This seems like an overtly political issue we're dealing with, but it's almost as if schools and heads and others want to bypass what seems to be a political discussion and say it's about protecting the child or vulnerable little kids. Could someone explain to me then why I'm stupid when it comes to this issue?
I wouldn't hesitate. I would say it's stupid, Ken, but I think one of the things, first of all, just to correct Toby, if I misrepresented the situation, the Prevent training is not delivered by the police. It's actually delivered by consultants that were employed by the DFE. And I think actually one of the reasons why they didn't want you to ask questions is because they didn't know how to answer them. They had a script that they had to speak from, and they didn't want somebody then starting to ask questions about, well, what do you exactly mean by that? So I think it was, as is often the case, more cock-up than conspiracy. in terms of the way in which it was delivered. And I think, you know, come back to your point there, Kevin, about why do a lot of schools see it as a safeguarding issue rather than a political issue. It's personally, and I can only speak for myself, it's because it's the only way that I can make any sense of it or make it in any way acceptable, because it is not acceptable as far as I'm concerned to try and limit free speech and discussion within a school environment. And if that were the agenda, and I suspect at one stage it was, but I agree with Toby in that I sense a bit of a retreat at the moment, because I think that some of the deficiencies of the original presentations and original ideas have been exposed. And as I say, I go back to not wanting to throw the baby out with the bathwater, in that I don't go along with the idea, and you know I don't, of that our children are so delicate they have to be protected from everything. I think that it's important that children are exposed to risk, that they are given the opportunity to fail, and that they are challenged, and that means that when they're challenged, in all probability, they will fail, and I think that's good, it's necessary, they can learn a lot from that. But in the same way, when it comes to safeguarding, whilst I do agree that I think the safeguarding agenda has probably gone too far, and that there's been some, and in the same way as the health and safety agenda has gone too far, I think you have to be careful to recognise there is a place for safeguarding, and that if we're talking about a situation, for example, where a teacher or a school have suspicions of child slavery, sweatshop labour, forced marriage, sexual exploitation, FGM, you know, then I think they do have a responsibility to do something about that. I don't think that's overprotecting and treating our children as if they're fragile flowers that must be, you know, that can't stick up for themselves. Yeah. But in the same token, if I could just finish, if young people are being encouraged to strap a bomb to themselves and walk into a shopping centre or an underground car park or something, and in the same way, if they were being encouraged to firebomb a scientist's car in Cambridge because they were engaged in animal research, or to throw a petrol bomb into a corner shop, then I think you should do something about that, because I do think that that's not being over protective of children. It's actually engaging in our proper responsibility as adults who have a duty of care to children that doesn't stop at the school gate.
Liz.
I think it really comes back to my point about community, actually, that I think it is about safeguarding, because it's safeguarding in the sense of creating a safe space within which you can discuss different ideas, including, you know, more extreme ideas, but to protect the more vulnerable young people from becoming, you know, embroiled in something that may lead to an end that they don't anticipate at the moment. So I think it's about creating a sense of community, and the school being, you know, there to create that future for young people, that they understand how society operates.
Zubeda.
I will kind of come to your question in a few seconds, but so my involvement with Prevent, in 2007 I used to work for the local authority in Birmingham on the Prevent strategy. I've also done a 2-year secondment with West Midlands Police with their counter-terrorism unit. And it was one of the reasons why we set up ConnectJustice, because we felt that where the direction of Prevent was moving, so bearing in mind CTSA came in 2015, there's been lots of shifts of where, so for example, Channel being kind of voluntary, where the shift into the classroom, into the educational space has been, you know, kind of interesting in the sense of where safeguarding kind of fixes itself, and where some of the resistance from NUT has been from the point of view that there's a lot of concern about how you strengthen young people's capability, but where you don't discriminate against young people. And the reason I mention that is, where does education fit in when the new legislation that's being proposed under the counter-extremism bill, for example, will be about banning extremist organisations, gagging individuals, and also empowering councils to close premises used to promote hatred. So who will define what extremism will be? So if you have that on the one side, where who defines what extreme is, and shouldn't we be encouraging extreme as a positive attribute rather than as a negative attribute? But kind of where it comes back into safeguarding, who decides that bit as well? So I haven't answered fully the question, because I think it's about kind of, there's a lot of questions that are never really raised in a public kind of forum as well. So I kind of want to park it there.
That's fair enough. Toby?
Maybe I'm stating the obvious, but you cannot compel, nor ought you try to compel or coerce anybody to adopt a belief. And I think that's a really important principle that we need to be clear on, and I think schools need to be clear on that as well. And I think we need to separate out conspiracy to commit a terrorist act, which is a fairly clear thing, from an ideological debate. However, I do think we need to not withdraw from that ideological debate. But that, I believe, is something that needs to be had out in the adult political sphere. And schools cannot compensate for that. So I'm very struck with a lot of the feedback I've had from good friends of mine in relation to the EU referendum, with a sense of despair, I'm going to leave the country, etc., etc. And the problems are, as they've always been, you've got to go out and argue for your point of view, and you've got to go and win that argument if you want to live in a world that you're happy to be in. I think that's something that has to happen in the adult political sphere in the first instance. So that's why I think it's interesting that we've got a confusion of an ideological discussion with a security discussion. And it is interesting the extent to which it's felt that schools can just be instrumentalised to address this security point. My point is that I think at the cost of undermining actually the good work that schools could do to argue for many of the values which actually align quite a lot with the things that are called British values, but the values of the Enlightenment: openness, reason, rational debate, discussion, tolerance, etc. But it's quite a different agenda when that's imposed on schools, because that undermines the autonomy of schools to engage with young people. The more difficult question, I suppose, is, are we, and this is where I think it's an interesting discussion, are we pulling back from that engagement? Because, I worry that we feel overly anxious about getting stuck in there and having the arguments out.
Okay, and I'm going to go out to the audience in a wee second, but I just wanted to maybe throw something back to you, Terry, which Toby says. So I'm the chair, and I'm ridiculously neutral and impartial and fair, but I've obviously got my opinion. I think you can guess that I don't really like Prevent too much. But really what I want to ask you, Terry, is because you came back eminently sensible at one level. Of course, we don't want situations where kids strap bombs to themselves. Of course, right? Toby makes the point about the distinction there between conspiracy to commit a crime and a strong ideological belief. And the reason why I want to press you on that is because good people like yourself who run schools seem to fall back into this framing of the discussion about safeguarding and protecting. And so my question really is, following on from what Toby said, can't we make a distinction between those two things? And if we do, it's not a safeguarding issue then?
Well, so I would come back and simply say, I think it is. I think part of the problem is, I think there was unnecessary legislation, because I think there is, if you put it in a safeguarding child exploitation environment, there was already legislation there in order to prevent that happening. In the schools and indeed individual teachers have a responsibility to report if they think that children are in danger in that sort of way, and that in danger may be from neglect or sexual exploitation or being forced to say sweatshop work, etc. And it also may be that they are in danger of being exploited, and that's the way I would use it, exploited for criminal purposes, because that's what we're talking about.
Okay, so 3/4 of my students when I was at school In fact, 9/10 should have been reported because we all support the IRA.
That was supporting the IRA. It may or may, it was, in fact, it probably was a criminal offence. Or I think probably technically being a member of the IRA rather than simply supporting it would have been the problem. But I would agree that you have to be very careful, and this is why I introduced the Andy Burnham thing, that you are not being counterproductive. Okay. I think that the problem was in Northern Ireland, that internment was counterproductive, and the same way, if you're not very careful, that the prevent strategy can be counterproductive. Okay. And I think simply expressing certain views is not something that in itself is something that we should be concerned about.
Okay, so it's okay to hold an extreme view to support ISIS, but as long as you don't actually go out and have a suicide bomb. Is that what you're saying?
Yeah, personally.
Well, this is fascinating. I'd be really interested to see what other people think. We're going to go out to the audience, take a few people, say what you want, ask a question. We'll take yourself, and then we'll take yourself.
This will be nice and quick, Rick. It's just picking up on your observation that it does seem a little bit of a shame that you've got a debate framed around a question and you've got no one arguing for no. I feel like we're hearing the sort of case for prosecution without hearing the case for defence. And it just so happens, I don't know a lot about mechanisms to prevent strategy. I'm all in favour of open discussion. I don't have an opinion of it in that sense. But I did, at the session I was at this morning, one of the speakers was quite obviously, I think I'm right in assuming, Muslim origin in the background. And he'd obviously spent a lot of time thinking about this, and he'd come to the conclusion that prevent was a good thing, and that British values was the right name. And he also felt that most of the problems people had with it were based on misconceptions. And for all I know, your whole argument is based on misconceptions.
Sure.
Because without having him here to test it, the claim that you said that you can't compel people to adopt a belief, that sounds like the kind of misconception that people might have. I don't know a lot about prevent, but I'd be very surprised if it is compelling people to adopt beliefs. If it's doing that, clearly it shouldn't be.
Just the person you speak now, I invited personally and chased them hard, but they wouldn't commit. The Cullen Foundation, who are completely in support of the Prevent agenda, emailed, phoned, be honest, they messed me about, in the end they didn't come, so I tried hard on that one. So you can come back that later, Toby. We'll take a few contributions at a time.
Thanks. So I'd say extremism can be a good thing. Some of the best ideas in history were considered extreme. At some time, universal suffrage is the first one that comes to mind. That said, I'm not sure many of those extreme ideas that people are worrying about right now are that good or positive or robust. But when I hear any sort of discussion about radicalisation, it seems the fear is that extreme ideas are somehow more persuasive, seductive or attractive than liberal ideas, and it seems to be a real defensiveness about the ability to persuade people with liberal ideas. Am I right about that, and if so, why?
Claire Fox.
I'm genuinely torn on all of this. I can't quite make my mind up about what I think. Because, so to sort of raise some of my concerns, Terry, for example, you use the example of 19 out of 20 examples they used were Muslim students. But the truth of the matter is that Prevent is in direct response to the radicalisation of young Muslims going to join ISIS. So there's then this kerfuffle that everyone says you can't make it target Muslim students because that leads to anti-Muslim, it's Islamophobic. So the response of the government is saying, oh, all right, we'll run out extremism. We think that's helpful. Why is that helpful? Right, that's actually completely confusing the issue. It is actually only aimed at Muslims, it would seem to me, because its purpose has to be, because that's what they set it up for. So they confuse it by saying, oh no, it could be the EDL. But they don't mean that, right? Everybody knows that this project, and in that sense, I've got some sympathy with the way it gets confusing, because I did think the government would think, oh God, are we going to stop young people joining ISIS? It's a very particular problem that's emerged in recent years, that's one thing. Secondly, I get nervous about a cultural cringe in relation to a discussion about ISIS, because I believe in free speech, of course, blah, 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 and I believe in liberal values. But sadly, in relation to this issue, when I've had this argument with teachers, it will often mean that they'll say things like, well, students raise the issue of joining ISIS and all the rest of it, and I said, well, that's interesting, and really not. And I think, oh God, don't say that's interesting. That's not interesting. I mean, and what I mean is you get a relativism, which is like, well, I was an extremist at university, at school, I was an anarchist, I was this, so they're just raising their extremism. And I think, don't go down that path, because there's a cultural cringe, almost as though joining ISIS is a bit like the equivalent of sort of like some radical, and I think it's different. But I don't know what to do about it. I'm not saying I've got a solution. So my only other thought then is the safeguarding is definitely not the way forward, because that then says that the young people aren't actively making decisions about this. And my experience, I'm not convinced that's true. I think that's the bloody tragedy for us, if I'm honest, that they are not being groomed in a sort of mindless way. The jihadi James have been called. But the girls from one of the schools, they spent a long time looking for that information. It's more complicated even for us. They're not kind of being taken away. And when they say, well, it's safeguarding, it ends up being it has to be safeguarded for my days, because nobody comes into the class and goes, I'm going to strap on the belt now. I mean, they're hiding it. That's the point. That's why we don't know. So we end up saying, well, it's their views we don't like, but maybe their views we have to argue with them about rather than report. Suspicious behaviour, like I've seen that lad with guns in his bag, report away.
Can I just come back to Claire on that? Because I think you're right, and I think the thing that you should do with extremist ideas, and I don't like the word extremist actually, but I think if you are saying what we mean, and I agree with you, the views of ISIS, is that you argue against them robustly. You let people express them, but you make sure that you have a climate in the school whereby, if you like, liberal values are robustly expressed. And I think you're right. I think sometimes that people are afraid of expressing those liberal values. I think that they sometimes can be seen as being less interesting, a bit boring and a bit tame. And I think you just have to be a bit more inventive and imaginative and robust and engage the kids in those sort of debates. You don't report them because they said something stupid. You explain to them why it was that what they said was stupid, and you go through you have a proper rational discussion. That's the problem I always had when we go back to our student days when I was a student about the NUS, the No Platform, which in those days was directed at the National Front. Is because what I felt that you should do, and still do in a different context, is bring them on and let them spout and then expose them for the fallaciousness of their ideas. And if you don't let them speak, or you try, all you do is you just drive it underground. And nowadays all it does is just gets expressed on the internet or somewhere, and then you don't get a chance to go back. And you have to convince kids who may or may not have been exposed to ideas which you don't think are good for them, and some ideas that kids are exposed to are not good for them, that you have to actually challenge them openly, and then actually you can be surprised how often you can actually talk kids round. If you actually are prepared to do that, instead of just saying, oh no, you mustn't say that.
That's dead on, Terry. And Toby, I'm going to get you to come back to this guy here in a minute. But first of all, Liz or Zubeda, do you want to pick anything up? It's up to yourself.
Well, I was actually just going to start with your point, which was the speaker, I think Rashad Ali, that you spoke about. So I'm Muslim, and in the sense of a lot of the communities that we work with are predominantly Muslim. And one thing that has come about is the fact that it is the polarisation of what is actually happening, and where communities that we work with, one thing that we've emphasised now with a lot of the young people that we work with, whether we're schools and what have you, is that we don't want to just work with Muslim kids, because actually they do feel targeted. They do feel that adults are actually picking on their points of views, which is the big premium kind of factor. That, having said that, we also we've just finished we did a crowdfunder last year where we got the stories of former extremists So there is a narrative of where people who have joined, because it is attractive, whether on the far right, whether on the kind of Islamist side, but those stories are not being heard. So if you look at, for example, people who've gone to Syria, there's a lot of people, I think there's about 800 people who've gone to fight in Syria, but the only thing that the government will throw at them is prison if they are convicted, for example. So we don't actually understand fully as to why people are going, and then what attracts them, what's the ideology. We know that a lot of younger people are attracted to that, but we don't actually have the younger voices who will be able to talk to them in that language, because there's a fear that if you provide the platform, are you giving them the space to articulate? And it comes back down to the debate bit of things. So Rashad was a former, in one sense, that you were talking about, the earlier speaker, but actually how do the current kind of batch of people who are attracted to a different type of ideology where you are radicalised predominantly online, how do you connect with those kind of audiences as well? And for me, the test is, would Nelson Mandela have been arrested for some of the views that he had expressed under current legislation? Would he have been able to kind of express his ideas under the legislation as well? So we don't stand the robustness of what we're actually also preaching. And all of that is contributing to fear, whether it's parents that we work with, whether it's teachers, because you've had the RAP training, for example, that's been mentioned, which was previously delivered by police officers, but is now delivered by other people. And what tends to happen is that there's no debate, because when we're doing the training now, people just want to clarify some of the questions that they've got. But if they can't clarify as teachers, then where do they go to for their knowledge as well? And so therefore, how will they have the conversations with young people? It's not all about religious ideology at the end of the day. It's about kind of liberal values and what have you, because and also about building young people's confidence as well.
Liz, did you want to pick up anything?
Just very quickly, I just want to say that in our research we found that you know, unlike some of the things that have been said, that schools don't feel that they're unable to talk about these things, actually. Most teachers felt that they were able to discuss, you know, different ideologies and to debate them. But I do agree that one of the issues, I think, is the knowledge that teachers have and where they go for that. So one of the questions we asked them, which is in this folder, but it was about whether they knew where to go internally and externally. So internally they were fine. So if there was some kind of debate or kind of something that kicked off, they knew where to go internally to kind of deal with that. But externally, in terms of getting advice and support, was quite low. So I think it is, you know, it is about offering that support, because I think ultimately it's about debating the issues, and the best way we can protect the young people is actually having that debate and you know, as you say, shouting them down if they have, not literally, if they have you know, views that we, you know, that having it out, absolutely.
Dead on. And Toby.
Yeah. On the compulsion element, I'm not suggesting that Prevent is attempting to compel people. I was asserting that when it comes to matters of politics and belief, one cannot compel somebody. And that's why it's not, as I understand it, a safeguarding issue. That's just the beliefs that people have. And I mean, I think we're not going to find some special technology or some special insight that's going to help us to explain why people have the beliefs that they do. But what we do need to do as adults is argue for the society that we want to live in. And that is a political question. And I think schools on their own are not going to be able to create the society that we want to live in. That's a debate that we need to have as adults. Where do we want to be in 10 years, 5 years' time? What society do we want to live in? And that is a question that has to be addressed at the level of politics. What I think is dangerous about Prevent, maybe because of its defensiveness, not of its assertiveness, is that it conflates those two issues: the question of conspiracy to commit a criminal act and the ideological problems that we have. And I think the worst thing that could happen is that we pull back from having that discussion about the kind of world that we want to live in, and we can have that discussion with students as well. But in the first instance, we have to have that between ourselves. And there's no security solution to that. I mean, it is a shame. It'd be nice to hear from people from the security services as to what's really driving the prevent agenda? I mean, is it genuinely creating leads that they, for their purposes, feel that are effectively contributing to preventing terrorist acts? I mean, that would be an interesting question. Or is the thing just an ideological exercise?